Let's complete our discussion of the integrated marketing communications aspect of market value creation by looking at the decisions that have to be made to have an effective IMC campaign. First of all, you have to consider the target audience for your marketing communications. Obviously, you have to think about what mediums or various ways that you can reach your target audience. And you want to make sure that you are trying to reach them in those methods. It might be very likely that you had never seen the promotional campaigns for a very effective marketing program if perhaps you are not in the target market for that particular product or service. So the first thing is to consider your target audience. Secondly, you have to set advertising objectives or marketing communication objectives. We talked in an earlier lesson about setting marketing objectives and how those could relate to profit or sales volume, and we indicated then that sales volume probably makes more sense because marketers don't control all aspects of profitability for a company. The same would hold true for marketing communications campaign objectives. As we discussed before, you can have a great marketing communications campaign but not actually sell more, perhaps because of problems with your product, your distribution, or your price. So we'll talk about what might be some more appropriate objectives for advertising and marketing communications. The next thing is to set your budget and define how much you're going to be spending on your MarCom program. Next, you have to design the ad or your marketing communications. You have to select and schedule the right medium to use, and then also do tests both before your marketing communication campaign and after your marketing communication campaign to see whether you achieved the objectives you set for yourself. And considering the target audience, once you know which media and how to reach them, another thing that you have to consider is whether you want to use a push or a pull or both promotional strategies. In a push strategy, the manufacturer promotes its product primarily to intermediaries and relies on them to then promote their product to the customer. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, for years manufacturers promoted themselves to physicians and pharmacists largely through the use of pharmaceutical sales reps, who then which made a lot of sense because then those intermediaries would be in touch with the customers when they needed the product or service. The problem was that sometimes physicians were not prescribing medicines for customers that really could help them. So in addition to using a push strategy, now the pharmaceutical companies also use what's called a pull strategy, where they promote to the customer and then the customer goes to the intermediaries, the physician for example, and asks the physician about the availability of a product from a particular pharmaceutical manufacturer. So I'm sure you've seen advertisements targeted to consumers that ask those consumers to ask their physician, in other words, ask an intermediary about a particular brand of medicine. You can find more information about push and pull marketing strategies at this reference. Let's talk a little bit about setting IMC objectives. We talked previously about whether your objectives should be related to sales volume or not. Obviously, one of the reasons that you do marketing communications is to get people to buy your products and services. If not, why even do marketing communications? But we also mentioned that you might be very good at designing a marketing communications campaign, but there might be other aspects of the marketing mix that affect the sales of your product. So what you might use instead would be some common communication objectives, something like which brand comes to mind first or second or third when you mention a particular product category. We would call that top of mind awareness. You might also measure how aware people are of a certain attribute toward your brand. You might also measure people's attitude toward your brand or a particular attribute of your brand. So when you write these common communication objectives, just like when we wrote marketing objectives, remember that our objectives must be specific, measurable, and time-oriented. It's not enough to say we'd like to increase the number of people who mention our brand first when we give them a product category, because it's not specific and it's not time-oriented. Let's look at an example. Increase the number of respondents that recognize XYZ Community College credits as transferable to state universities from 25% to 45% by January 1, 2015. Is it specific? Definitely. Increasing the number of respondents that recognize credits as transferable. Is it measurable? Yes, from 25 to 45%. Is it time-oriented? Yes. The question is, would it be a top-of-mind awareness, a brand attribute awareness, or an attitude toward brands and or attributes? In this case, it would probably be an attribute awareness, the attribute being transferable credits of a particular brand, XYZ Community College. Another thing to consider as you're developing your marketing communications objectives is whether you want to inform, persuade, or remind people. Many times in the introduction stage of the product life cycle, we might focus purely on informing them of this new product. Whereas in growth, you would probably have to rely on persuading them of the value of your brand versus competing brands. When your product is very mature, you might simply keep your product in the minds of consumers. However, keep in mind the real purpose of any marketing communications is to persuade people to buy your brand. So persuasion is very important in marketing communications campaigns. Let's talk next about setting the budget for marketing communications. We'll review 3 approaches. The first is a percentage of sales approach. This particular approach, percentage of sales, is probably one of the most common approaches, and it's also probably the simplest approach to setting an advertising budget. We're visiting advertising age here, and we're looking at various product categories and what, on the average, all people in that industry spend on advertising as a percentage of sales. Let's look at some examples here. If we were to look at beverages, we would see that beverage companies overall, on the average, spend 7% of their sales revenue on advertising or promotion. Let's look at cigarettes. Overall, on the average, cigarette manufacturers spend 2% of their sales revenue on advertising and promotion. Let's look at liquor. Overall, the liquor industry spends about 16% of its sales revenue on advertising or promotion. The issue here is, just because the average for your industry is a certain amount, does that mean that your brand needs to spend that same amount? Might it be that there's something new about your brand? Maybe you're a new entrant into that product category, or for whatever reason you need to spend more or less. The other thing is that maybe your promotional message is more or less effective than your competitors' promotional messages. and therefore might require you to spend less or more on promotion, just simply because your message is so much more effective and resonates more. So I think you can see how a percentage of sales is one method of setting the IMC budget. Keep in mind here too that in times of declining sales, you would actually be spending less on promotion, and that doesn't seem quite right. Another approach to setting your IMC budget is to look at what your competitors are spending. And if they are spending more on promotion, you may need to increase your promotional expenditures as well, just to remain competitive. Probably one of the most marketing-oriented approaches to setting your IMC budget would be to come up with the objectives and tasks that you'll have to do to achieve those objectives. For example, if your objective is to increase the number of people that recognize credits from your college as transferable to state universities, that's your objective. What are you going to have to do to achieve that change in recognition? Are you going to have to advertise in a variety of school newspapers? Are you going to have sales representatives call on high school guidance counselors? Are you going to have to schedule some events that target parents about paying for college and transferability of credits to try to get parents and prospective students to visit your college? Are you going to have to run some particular type of contest on social media to engage people with your brand? If those are the tasks that you're going to have to do to achieve your objectives, you would then estimate the costs of those tasks and add those costs up to set your IMC budget. Another thing to keep in mind after you've set your budget is actually designing your ad and what approach your ad will take. Will you use a testimonial where you show actual users of the product telling how happy they were with the outcome of the product use? You might use a humor or a fear appeal. You might show someone in a typical day in the life of, that's called a slice of life. Let's look at an example of how two different companies used different approaches when they designed their advertising for the holiday season. This particular example looks at two different retailers, Kmart and Gap, and their different approaches to holiday advertising. Let's look first at Kmart's approach to a holiday ad in a TV commercial. Okay, we'll stop at that. I think that some of you might consider that humorous. It's definitely an attempt at a humor approach to advertising design. Keep in mind, though, that sometimes humor or fear appeals can actually offend some people. So there's a fine line with that. Let's contrast that with this particular ad about the Gap and how it's really just a feel-good campaign that really doesn't push the Gap clothes as much as it pushes the concepts the retailer believes in. Hopefully saying that, hey, if you like our Gap commercials, you'll also like our clothing brands. And I'm going to skip through parts of this because it's a rather long commercial.
This is my calling in life. Like, this is what I want to do.
If you keep on working hard, there's nothing that's going to stop you. He's a living icon.
I saw him a couple times in school, but I didn't ever say hi because, it's him.
The best is yet to come, and say, won't that be fine?
You think you've seen the sun, but you ain't seen it shine.
Wait till you see that sunshine day.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Still, it's a real good bet.
The best is yet to come. Well, I like what Duke Ellington said. He said, number one, don't quit. Number two, listen to number one.
So you can see here how the Gap supports the Arts Foundation and the positive PR that they're trying to build through this particular commercial. Again, what we're illustrating here is using different approaches to design the advertising for your marketing communications program. After designing the ad, you have to think about where you're going to schedule your promotion, in what medium, and how you're going to schedule it. Are you going to have a continuous schedule where you spend the same amount on marketing communications every month or every time period? Are you going to have a flighting schedule where you have periods of intense marketing communication followed by periods of no marketing communication followed by periods of intense competition, etc.? Are you going to use a combination of the two, a pulsing, where you have periods of higher followed by periods of lower marketing communication, but you always have something in the marketplace? So I hope this illustrates just briefly for you some of the decisions that you have to consider when planning an integrated marketing communications campaign. First of all, considering the target audience and how to reach them, where to reach them, and whether to use push versus pull promotional strategies. Setting advertising objectives and the difference between communications and sales objectives and the reasons for each. Different methods of setting your marketing communications budgets. Different types of ads that you might design to send your message to the consumer, selecting the right medium to use and scheduling them in a certain way, and then also how are you going to test your target audience before the marketing communication campaign and after the marketing communication campaign to see whether you've had any improvement and whether you met your promotional objectives.